Hey, what's going on, guys? How's it going? It's Michael from the Honest Youth Pastor. Tonight, we're going to talk about, briefly talk about the Hillsong documentary that came out on Discovery Plus. I know lots of people have seen it. Some people haven't even heard of it. So I kind of want to make sure that we talk about this in such a way that if you haven't seen it or if you don't even care about it, you can at least learn something from this whole thing, hopefully. So one of the things I want to start off with just in general is talking about the importance of elders, right? So as we talk tonight about Hillsong and everything that's going on at Hillsong and everything that the documentary covers, I want to make sure we talk about primarily the importance of elders, because what we're going to see as we kind of talk about this is that from my perspective, at least the 3 episodes that we have within the kind of the docu-series of Hillsong and Megachurch Exposed, is that eldership is the main thing that is lacking within Hillsong, has been lacking in Hillsong, is one of the results of Hillsong going through what it's going through right now. So really quick, just to recap, in case you haven't seen it, in case you don't have Discovery Plus, in case you do not care to see it at all, let me kind of break it down in a very simplistic way for you. There's 3 episodes in total. The first episode is basically sort of the rise of Hillsong, sort of, and then that's the first half, and the second half is basically the rise of Carl Lentz. It sort of documents where Hillsong came from, where it developed from. And one of the things that is sort of off the bat that we kind of see is a little weird is Frank Houston, which is Brian Houston's father, which Brian Houston is the pastor, or was the pastor, of Hillsong International. Frank goes and plants a church. Basically, he comes out of the Assemblies of God, and he goes and he starts a church, and it does apparently fairly well. And then he goes, sort of branches off and makes the church called, I believe it's the Church of the Hills or something like that. And then he puts his son, Brian Houston, in charge of the church. Now, one of the things, and again, this is, you can't really take a lot from the documentary because it's Discovery Plus. So they're not going to do a lot of biblical background here, clearly, as far as qualifications go. But one of the things that seems sort of clear, and just watching some of Brian's sermons, is that I'm not sure how necessarily structured the church was in regards to making sure that Brian was qualified to be a pastor and an elder. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I'm just saying that the documentary sort of puts it out there that, Frank just puts his son in charge of this church, which I've definitely seen that happen before. So it's not at all of an odd thing if he did. But basically, the first episode talks about the rise of Hillsong, where Brian got the idea to sort of get as many people in the seats as possible, and then sort of use their tithe to sort of build this church in order to go out and further the kingdom, essentially, is the idea. And then the second half of the first episode talks about Carl Lentz really taking off. The idea that Hillsong New York takes off because of Carl's personality primarily. And I can attest sort of to that, because when Hillsong New York rather was kind of coming into being, that was when I was graduating college and then sort of going into youth ministry. And I remember hearing stories and reading stories and articles that were put out that were talking about, like, there was a line around the building to get into Hillsong New York on a Sunday. And so it was one of those things that were like, it was as somebody that was just entering ministry. I was talking to other people that were in ministry, and it was like, wow, how do you get people to line up outside of a church to come in? And it was sort of this idea that, like, we need to sort of do church like Hillsong does it. And this was way before I really got to thinking through that in a biblical way, but like, that was sort of the buzz. And they talk about that in episode 1. Now you get to episode 2. And so episode 1 sort of lands on a cliffhanger, right? With the lady, and I forget her name, that Carl had an affair with. But the second episode basically opens up with Carl's affair, and then it talks about other scandals within Hillsong, basically lining up that Carl's affair and Carl's sort of the whole situation that happened in Hillsong, New York, isn't its own isolated event. It's actually sort of within the culture of Hillsong, and it's happened in various different places at various different churches where leaders have had to step down. They just weren't as well known as Carl. So that's basically the second episode. Again, I'm condensing this a lot. episode 3 basically opens up with how Hillsong basically recruits college students, how they make it sound exciting, but then they also sort of abuse those college students by making them do internships and work for free for the church. As far as I think it's mentioned in one of the interviews they do, that someone's entire like class practicum would be just cleaning the church, like you're getting credit for that, and it was sort of weird. And then the back end of that is basically Frank Houston's abuse of children. And then it sort of ends on the note of talking about where Brian was covering up for him, and Brian was being put, like being brought before the law in Australia as somebody that was sort of complicit in Frank Houston's abuse because Brian covered it up. And the documentary actually ends with a very recent event with Brian stepping down from Hillsong. So that's sort of the whole thing with Hillsong. So, like I said, beginning, I think when we talk about Hillsong, like this is sort of just an example that's out in front of the church right now, with along with a lot of different examples throughout history, right? About where eldership is incredibly important within the church, right? So if we look just a brief look at scripture, we see that within the early church, within like the early church just coming to being, we see that elders are put in place within the church. So these elders though have certain qualifications. And this is where I think when I was watching the Hillsong documentary, that this really stuck out, that the pastors and the people that are in charge of some of these churches, not all of them. I mean, apparently there's a lot of branch offs that like I don't even know about, never heard of before. In fact, I saw an article the other day, I wasn't able to read it, that apparently some of the branches of Hillsong have broken off since the documentary came out and since this whole thing came to light. So I'm not saying, they're all like this, but clearly what we have seen, not just with Hillsong's like just an example that we can put under the microscope of a much bigger problem, which is that there are people that are in charge of some of these churches that are not qualified to be elders or pastors over these people. So what are these qualifications then? Now, you may know these. I've talked about these a lot. I have a whole video. I forgot to link it, but if you're watching the replay, I'll link it in the description below. A whole very long video sort of walking through eldership and sort of structures that we can have in the church. But we're going to go on a much sort of much three specific scriptures we're going to be looking at for eldership in the church, and these are incredibly important. Okay. There's a reason that we see them in scripture. We know just reading the New Testament that the churches, the ecclesias, the gathering of believers come together, but then there has to be some sort of leadership within those gatherings in order to take care of things like what we've talked about recently, church discipline, take care of making sure that there's an organization of things occurring, like that the church is taking care of not only the people within inside the church, but they're taking care of the communities around them. Like that there is sound doctrine being preached, that not just any Jim, Joe, or Nancy can get up and say something, and that it's considered fact, biblical fact. Like there's elders that are in place for a reason. So let's look at this. The first one that you may or may not know of, right, is Titus chapter 1, verses 5-9. And we have, again, I would encourage you to read the whole first chapter, but this is the section specifically that you're probably familiar with in regards to qualifications of elders. And we're going to go ahead and read that. And it says this. This is why I left you in Crete. Paul is writing to Titus. This is why I left you in Crete, so that you might put what remained into order and appoint elders in every town as I have directed you. Now, here's the thing that we have to understand, and this is the model that I don't think we see a lot, and people will have contention with this depending on the denominations that they grew up in. But when we see eldership in the New Testament, we see elders. Like there is a group of elders, right? That there's not just one person in charge, one person running the show, one person calling all the shots. There are elders that are put in place in all of these gatherings, and they're put in place for a reason. One of the things, if you watch the documentary from Hillsong, is what you're going to see is that Brian or Carl specifically, they're really zeroed in onto this documentary, but they're sort of above and outside everyone else. In the documentary, and I think even before the documentary came out, it was pretty open that Carl would come in to preach, and then as soon as he got done preaching, he would get in a car and he would leave, and he'd have no interaction or contact with the people that he was supposed to be a pastor over. And he was the only one, right? So there were other people that were helping him, but he was clearly like the boss, the one in charge. So what we see here when Paul writes Titus is that there's supposed to be elders appointed in all these ecclesias, these churches. And these are the qualifications starting at verse 6. If anyone is above reproach, the husband of one wife, and his children are believers and not open to charge of debauchery or insubordination, for an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word that is taught, so that he may be able to give instructions in sound doctrine and also rebuke those who contradict it. So there's a lot. We could just go on Titus and look at sort of the Hillsong documentary and say, okay, are these the qualities that we sort of see being put forth from Brian and from Carl? Now, again, I think we have to be honest here that Discovery Plus is not a Christian channel. It doesn't have the intent of trying to direct people necessarily to the scripture and say, well, look, Brian and Carl are disqualified because of Titus. Like, they have no interest in that. But as Christians, we do need to have that interest in saying, okay, well, what are the qualifications then of somebody, regardless of the size of church? Like, what are the qualifications to be the leaders in those churches? And we see the one thing is above reproach. Now, we don't really have the time to dig really deep in. Again, I'll kind of put the link in the description below where I kind of walk through this in a much longer format if you're interested in it. But above reproach is that you're not open. Like, nobody can say, oh, yeah, but you don't know this or that about this pastor. You don't know this or that about this elder. Like, I've got blackmail on this person, right? The idea is that they are above that. They're above reproach. No one can bring anything against them because they haven't done anything. And when we look at the Hillsong documentary, what's pretty clear is that people did have things on Brian and Carl. We have the husband of one wife, right? Carl clearly, within the adulterous relationship, broke that. And then his children must be believers and not open to charge of debauchery or insubordination. We won't spend a lot of time on this one simply because that doesn't really come up in the documentary. But this is an important note, right? There are people that, because churches want elders and they want leaders, they will bypass certain parts of these qualifications in order to get people in eldership position. So they will appoint elders that currently have children in their house that are open to the charge of debauchery. They're openly insubordinate, right? And we have to watch for that. So verse 7, for an overseer is God's steward. He must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain. There's a couple things here within the documentary. They mentioned a few times, Carl specifically, but also one of the other pastors often would drink pretty frequently. In one of the situations, I think it's episode 2, one of the pastors of the churches gets incredibly drunk and actually, I don't know if assault would be the right word, but he does inappropriate things with somebody else that's the party without their consent, and this is why he gets fired. So these are the certain things we're looking for, right? Like, what are the qualifications for an elder? Well, he's not quick tempered, he's not a drunkard, he's not greedy for gain. One of the things that does come up, and actually the guy that does Preachers and Sneakers has a pretty long part in this documentary. I believe it's episode 2. And he goes through and explains, like, some of these things that Carl had were incredibly expensive. I'm sorry, my throat's really dry. And he walks through that. And one of the things we have to watch for, it's not the pastor can't have nice things, but like, what are they doing with the money they do have, right? Are they being greedy? Are they buying expensive things? He must be hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. These are all characteristics that we don't necessarily see. Like, when we watch the Hillsong documentary, we don't see these being virtues of Brian or Carl as is sort of outlaid for us. And aside from Brian and Carl, these are the things that we really need to look for when we are in our own churches and we're talking about our own elders. Like, are these qualifications? And here, we can't take that lightly. Like, there's a reason that they have to be a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, and holy and disciplined. Why? Because they have to be above reproach. And these qualities are going to keep a pastor above reproach. So here's the last thing, right? Verse 9. He must hold firm to the trustworthy word as taught, so that he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also rebuke those that contradict it. No one's going to listen to a pastor if he's clearly doing things that's against the word, right? If he's not above reproach, then they're going to call him on it. But because he's above reproach, because he's holy, upright, self-controlled, disciplined, he's able to teach doctrine and give instruction and also rebuke those that contradict it. Now, let's move on to the second passage. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And we're going to see here a similar sort of structure laid out. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 says this. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well, with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for the church of God? Or care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into the snare of the devil. Sorry. Okay. So you're going to see there's a lot of crossover here between Titus and Timothy. A lot of these same things: self-controlled, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. All of these things are attributes of an elder over the people of God. And we're going to see why sort of here in a minute when we go to Peter. Peter sort of elaborates a bit on this in a very condensed down fashion. But when one of the things that came up as I was watching all three of these episodes, the first one, kind of the rise of Hillsong, Brian being put in charge of the Hills Church, that, and then really capitalizing on Hillsong music and using that to grow the church. And then we see sort of Carl's affair. We see the other scandals within the church. What really comes to mind is like, well, where were these qualifications whenever you're putting someone into these positions? Classically, and it really depends on what denomination you're from, the church structure of governance you're from. But classically, what would happen is you're going to have a group of elders that's already there, that have met these qualifications, and then they are going to be mentoring and bringing other men up to see, are these men qualified to take over for these other leaders whenever these other leaders die or retire or rotate out. And the idea is that you always have leadership in sort of coming in behind the ones that are already there, being mentored, being verified, being checked. Lots of churches, this takes a year or more to verify that these men are qualified by scripture to take these positions. In fact, after a year, typically what will happen is that they'll bring them before the church, and then they'll read off these qualifications, and they'll ask the body, hey, we are going to certify this man as an elder in this next month. If you know that this man does not meet these qualifications, if you know something about him that contradicts these qualifications that we maybe have missed, let us know, so that we can take care of this and he doesn't get ordained as an elder. What typically happens, though, I would say that's the correct approach. What typically happens is that somebody will come out of college. So, for example, Carl, just as an example, because we're talking about Hillsong, goes to Hillsong College, comes out of Hillsong College, gets put into a church called, I believe it's the Wave Church, becomes the young adult pastor. There's some questionable stuff there. They interview some people that say that Carl had some sort of, he tried to get with some girls while he was there. That's what the documentary says. And there were some questionable things that say he wasn't qualified to be in the position he was when he was there. But because he had graduated from college at Hillsong College, he was now qualified to be a pastor there, and he gets hired. Typically, that's exactly how it works. Somebody goes to college, they get a certificate, they get ordained, and then they get put in a position with the assumption that somebody has checked on these qualifications beforehand, which I would say is a very modern way of doing it, but it's not helpful, because people can get into positions in churches that don't fit these qualifications simply because they have a degree from somewhere that says, yeah, this person knows this or that about theology. We have these qualifications for a reason. So what we see here is a lot of the similar qualifications from Titus are here in Timothy, right? One of the ones that really is built out a bit more is verses 4 and 5, is that, he has to be able to manage his home well. He has to be able to if he can't manage his household, if he can't say, if he can't keep control of his own children, if he can't run his home in an efficient manner, then who's to say he's going to be able to run the church well? Because the church is just a bigger cosm of the family, which is a smaller version of the church, right? This idea that we are a family that comes together to worship the Lord, to sing songs, to fellowship, to read scripture, and to grow together. The church is just a bigger version of the family. There's going to be fights, there's going to be disagreements, there's going to be people that get mad. And if the pastor, if the elder can't manage his own household, how is he going to manage a bigger household of people? Which is a very good qualification, because oftentimes you will see pastors or elders be put in positions and they don't manage their own family well. With this example, right, within Hillsong, Brian covers up for his dad, Carl has an affair, neither one are managing their households well, and this is a qualifier. Like, if you can't manage your home well, you're not qualified to manage God's family, his bigger little ecclesia, his meeting of these family members together very well. And this is sort of like expanded on a little bit in verse 6. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be thought of well by outsiders. And this idea is that, like, just because you get saved and then you go to college, then you're like, the idea that that now makes you qualified to be an elder is untrue. You can't just like there's lots of people, and I've known a couple that will get saved. They'll have a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement, be able to speak really well. And because of that, the assumption will be made that, well, they should be a pastor then. We should put them in front of people. They have they have a lot of like energy that will get people going. And that's sort of something you see. I wouldn't say that Carl was a recent convert when he gets put in these positions. But one of the things that really propels people into positions of pastor or elder, wrongly, I think, and I think we see what happens when that occurs just from the Hillsong documentary, is that like there's a lot of problems that come with that. Just because someone can speak well and communicate well doesn't mean they're qualified for that, to be an elder or a pastor over people. Now, this last one that you've probably heard of is First Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. And it says this: "So I exhort the elders among you," again, elders, more than one, "as a fellow elder and a witness to the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Likewise, you who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, with humility toward one another. For God opposes the proud, but he gives grace to the humble." First Peter here is really this really beautiful passage of what it looks like for a pastor to be a shepherd. So you have men that are qualified to be elders. You hold them up against Titus and Timothy, and if they become elders, that's great. But like, First Peter is the living out of that, right? A shepherd of God's flock, exercising oversight. Well, how? Not because you feel like you have to, but because you want to, right? This is the whole, if someone desires to be an elder, he desires a good thing, right? Because you want to guide God's people, you want to help God's people, you want to be there for God's people. And what we see is sort of an opposite. Like, there's a piece of that that goes way beyond the Sunday service, way beyond I think it's episode 1 of the documentary. One of the ladies is like, I'm not religious, but it was like TED Talks that were really emotional, right? Being a shepherd goes way beyond giving some motivational TED talk. It's being involved in the lives of the people that are in your church. You're doing it because you want to, as God would have you do it, right? And then we have the second half of verse 2: "Not full shameful gain, not for shameful gain, but eagerly, right? This idea that like you don't a pastor isn't in it to make a bunch of money or make a name or brand for themselves. And one of the things we really see with that throughout the Hillsong documentary, and again, it's just like one church that has a magnifying glass on it that is like many other churches, that it's this sort of this brand that's known for something. And this what we see here in First Peter is that shepherds aren't supposed to do it for shameful gain. They do it because they want to. They're eagerly willing to be a part and be in the church, leading God's people, helping them out. Verse 3, not domineering over them, but being examples. And I think this is one of the things we see whenever we talk about churches like Hillsong, when we see this documentary or there's lots of churches that are an example of this, where it's sort of like, you will do what I say because I'm over you. Rather, what Peter sets forth is like, I am to live as an example for you to follow after, right? You are going to be able to respect. And I think this is one of the things that so many people just really have a bad taste in their mouth about elders or church discipline and things like leadership in general, is because we have a lot of people that have gotten in church leadership that are unqualified to be there. They do not fit the qualifications of 1 Timothy and Titus. They don't. And they're there and they're exercising authority in a domineering way and not a gentle way, right? Not in a way that says, follow after me, but rather you're going to come whether you like it or not. Whenever you receive, and there's so many people that I've talked to that have not been on the good end of this, and this is the really sad part, but whenever you receive church discipline in a way from an elder that you respect, that you love, that you know has the best interest for you, you receive that differently because you know it's for your good. You know they're not domineering over you, but rather they're being an example for you. Well, how can they be an example for you? Well, they're a great example for you. Why? Because they exercise the qualifications that we've seen in Titus and Timothy, right? They're holy, they're disciplined, they're self-controlled, they're not greedy, they're not a drunkard, they're not quick-tempered. Like you, that's the example that they're supposed to be. That's why those qualifications are there. That's why they're needed. And that's why I think if you watch the documentary of Hillsong, what you're going to see is that you get this really bad taste in your mouth going, that's not what a pastor's supposed to do. Right. And when they interview these people that used to go to Hillsong, you can tell there's like this really, I don't know if a bitterness would be the right word, but there's just this like really bad taste in their mouth from the fact of how this all went and how this went down and how it continues to be propped up because it's not done in a scriptural way. Right. It's a domineering, not a leading by example. Now, Peter is very careful to end this in verse 4 and say, and then when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive your unfading crown of glory. The idea is if you're leading well, if a shepherd does what he's supposed to do, if he's qualified, if he's put in place and he leads well with what we've seen in these first few verses, then when Jesus appears again, that pastor is going to get an unfading crown of glory. Why? Because he's done what he was supposed to do. He willingly led God's people. He willingly was there being an example. He wasn't there for the money. He was there because he wanted to be there, right? And then it's this verse 5, right? Now the assumption in verse 5 is that the pastor has done what he's supposed to do. So in verse 5, likewise, those who are younger, be subject to the elders. Clothe yourselves, all of you, that includes the people that are under the elders and the elders, with humility towards one another, right? That I'm lucky enough, blessed enough. I guess lucky enough's not the right word. I'm blessed enough to be in a church. We're not perfect. My pastor's not perfect, but I can see verse 5 lived out because I know that those that are in eldership above me are there for my good. They're leading by example. They're not perfect, but they are there and they are qualified to be there. And he's leading by example. So it's easy to submit yourself to the elders and their judgment because you know that they're qualified to be there because of what we see qualifications wise. We know that elders are supposed to be there guiding the church. We see that throughout the New Testament. And then we have these verses to keep pastors and elders in check to say you're qualified or you're not qualified. Like it's pretty clear. And I know people really, 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 really want to like we've talked about, right? So when we go back through Titus here, you can look through those qualifications. Timothy here, you can look through those qualifications. People will try to take bits and pieces of those out, and they do so to their detriment, right? They do so to their detriment. I guarantee you, in every church I am aware of, the reason that it falls, or the reason that it's a failure, or the reason the pastor fails at his duty and the whole mess ensues from that, is because these qualifications were not met every time. So when we look at Hillsong, we look at the Hillsong documentary and we say, wow, what, how in the world did something get this big and have this many issues and put somebody like Carl Lentz in charge? Well, it's because of, well, the lack of understanding the importance of elders and the qualifications of eldership. When you watch through, and again, Discovery Plus isn't there to point you towards scripture, to tell you what elder qualifications are. They could care less. But when you watch the documentary, what you're going to see is a number of instances come up in which these qualifications are clearly not met or upheld. And when you get to the end of it, for me at least, I'm like, wow. Like, there are people, they interview probably at least a dozen or more people throughout this documentary. And these people have either left their churches or just left the faith entirely because of what they experienced at Hillsong. And the sad reality of this isn't just Hillsong that we're dealing with. Obviously, the documentary is about that, but you have churches everywhere that have put unqualified men in eldership positions, ignoring the qualifications that we read in Titus and Timothy and Peter. And you have churches that will function for a while. You can get a really long way. You can get away with it for a really long time on just charisma and organizational planning. But eventually that church will fall apart because those qualifications are important. Somebody will get greedy for gain. Somebody will maybe get drunk. Somebody won't live up to the qualifications of being a one-woman man. Somebody will not. They'll be open to debauchery. They won't be above reproof, right? These are the reason the qualifications are there. To one, hold those elders to a standard. And as an elder, you go like, these are the things I'm going to be held as an elder, as a pastor. I'm held accountable before God for these things. And then for the people that the elder is over, for us as congregants to say, like, these aren't my qualifications. These are the biblical qualifications put forth to qualify for this. So there's a lot of issues. There's a lot of issues I could say about Hillsong and about Carl Lentz and all of that. But all of them would come back to the qualifications we see in scripture there. So it's incredibly important to have biblical elders. Why? Because biblical elders are laid out for a reason. Paul and Peter and the apostles knew that you have to have qualified elders in position to lead these churches, to teach sound doctrine, to be able to refute people that come in that are teaching unsound doctrine. And they have to be live up to a certain set of qualifications so that people take them seriously, so that they can lead well. So what I would encourage you to do, to go back, look at these qualifications. I'll pull them up one more time if you want to write them down in case you've never heard of these before. We have Titus chapter 1, verses 5 through 9. We have 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. And we have 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. These aren't the only places that qualifications are brought up in scripture, but these are the three places that, like, they're pretty well laid out in a very, like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, these are, like, just laid out as qualifications. I would encourage you to look at those. I would encourage you, if you do, or if you have watched the documentary, to just watch it through and think of those scriptures as you're watching it through. And in the churches you're in, I would encourage you to sort of ask, hey, what is our eldership policy? Like, how do we elect pastors? How do we elect elders? or just ask, do I have a healthy leadership structure at my church? Is it all on one guy's back, or do we have an eldership that assists the pastor? Do we have deacons? We haven't even talked about deacons. You could do a whole video on that as well. Like, do we have deacons assisting the elders? Like, there's a whole structure that God has so graciously given us to run his church. And oftentimes it's neglected. And when it is, it's neglected to our shame, because he has given us this beautiful gift of the body and how to run it and what to do with it and how to do it. And oftentimes we don't do a great job. So guys, hopefully this was helpful. If it was, make sure you share it, like it, comment, all the cool things. We will be back in a couple days with another video. We have a video coming out this Saturday, a sermon review of Ron Carpenter. If you find that helpful, that'll be coming up on Saturday. The patrons have already got I've already got that. They got it Wednesday. And if you want to support what we're doing, videos like this, the sermon reviews, the podcast that would come out, the lives, all of that, you can support that if you'd like by just giving a like, giving a share, or becoming a patron and helping us out that way. Guys, thank you for watching, subscribing, liking, just being here and listening to me talk. Thank you so much. I'll talk to you later.